Break free from the ordinary and check out a podcast with thought-shattering concepts that will reshape the way you interpret the world.
We are the Swerve Podcast, and our mission is very simple. Each episode, we research and discuss topics that swerve off the mainstream path in an attempt to understand everything in the universe, one obscure topic at a time.
Whether you're into forgotten history, cutting-edge science, strange frontiers of the unknown, or just need a good laugh in an uncensored way, the Swerve Podcast has you covered.
Listen to the Swerve Podcast today on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other major platforms.
Let's go. Heidi Love in the house, dropping knowledge and facts, uncovering the truth. No need for acting lax. She ain't afraid to speak her mind, breaking through the lies, rising up with love, taking us to new highs. We're living in a world full of secrets and deceit, but Heidi's here to expose, bringing truth to the beast. She's got a message, spreading it far and wide, from addiction to hope. She's on the other side.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unfiltered Rise with me, Heidi Love. And today I am happy to announce that I have Dr. Richard B Spence with me. He is a multi-book author. He does a lot of delving, even on History Channel stuff and everything into Crowley and spies. And he's got a treasure trove of things. And I'm just happy to say that he joined me today so we can talk about it. How are you doing today over there, Mr. Or Dr.
I'm doing great. I am delighted to be here.
Awesome. We were talking a little bit in the pre-show there that there's some fun things that we kind of were discussing about old FBI papers. And I was like, ooh, we got to talk about this. So I'll let you start.
Okay. Well, people often ask me, how do you get interested in these, arcane, some cases disturbing topics? why am I always dealing with these things? And my answer to that is that, well, one thing leads you to another. So you start out with, in terms of kind of academic background, where my academic training is, it's in modern Russian history, modern Russian and Eastern European history. So simplest way to explain that is if you study modern Russian history, you study the Russian Revolution. And if you study the Russian Revolution, what do you run into? Well, first of all, it's a revolution. So it's a conspiracy. So
right.
No revolutions without conspiracies. If you don't conspire, you'll be hanging by noon the next day. And then you begin to find out that, this is not just a revolutionary conspiracy. There are a whole variety of secret societies, intelligence agencies, all involved in this. It just becomes more and more, it's the rabbit hole situation, which, and the rabbit hole gets deeper and deeper, begins to branch off into other directions. So you might say that it was my academic study of the Russian Revolution that led me to secret societies and to espionage, and then ultimately to the connection with occultism. And that, of course, then eventually, as you mentioned the word occultism, and that will lead you to the poster boy for occultism, Aleister Crowley. Yes. So that's kind of how I got along. So you look for one thing. So the thing about the FBI files, before there was the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, there was just the Bureau of Investigation, which had been around since the early 20th century. So keep in mind that in 1917 and 1918, the period we're talking about, it's not like the FBI today. It was a pretty small organization. There were maybe 300 agents that were, mostly ex-private detectives and cops scattered around the country. But nevertheless, they investigated a variety of crimes or suspicious activity. And so what I was doing is that I was looking through digitized Bureau of Investigation records from around that period, from World War I. And I was searching for the term airship. I was actually looking for something else, and what popped up was this file that had no particular title to it. It's just called Various because no one could figure out what it was about. It was about 400 pages long, and what it did was to chronicle this whole investigation by this agent in Salt Lake City by the name of Leon Bone, who started in 1917 and into 1918, investigating reports of weird lights in the sky. Okay, so you know what direction we're heading there.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
You're going to run into UFOs. Yeah. Okay. But keep in mind, this is 1917. There's no such thing as an unidentified flying object. There's just weird airships and lights in the sky. But it's the same pattern. You've got people across the state who report seeing these things flying around. And let's face it, a lot of Utah today is fairly remote. In 1917, it was even more remote. And also keep in mind that aircraft themselves are in their infancy. So the whole idea of seeing something with lights on it flying around in the sky was very unusual. So Bone figures that, well, he's got like sheriffs and mayors, reporting, reliable witnesses, the same sort of thing, people that don't seem to be drunk or kooky. So he decides he's going to look into it, and then he sees this little item in a newspaper, and in it there's a guy by the name of John Van Valkenburg who's interviewed, and Van Valkenburg says, "Oh yeah, my friends and I know all about these lights because we're the guys that are actually flying these things, and we're sort of this group of inventors, and we've come up with these ships." And he has all kinds of, claims that they can travel 800 miles an hour, that we, fly to San Francisco, and in a very short period of time. And again, 800 miles an hour today may not seem like that much, but in 1917, no one's ever heard of it. And there are all sorts of things. One thing that sort of caught my attention is that in describing how these flying machines work, he goes, well, the key to it is this little device that's about the size of your fist and has counter-rotating discs inside it. That's kind of a weird thing, because if you then look into later descriptions of things that are supposed to be UFO technology, anti-gravity technology, you'll run across to references to rotating discs or counter-rotating discs. So here's this guy, again, in 1917 Utah, a guy whose background, by the way, is essentially in mining and metalwork. And he's also he lays tiles. I should put it this way: he's actually a mason.
Oh, wow.
and a Freemason at the same time.
Oh, boy.
But a guy who has some, he has no technical training. This isn't a scientist, but he's claiming that, yeah, we have these little fist-sized devices with these rotating discs, and this is what we use to power our craft that can fly in all kinds of weather and can go any kind of distance. And so what really caught my attention is that here you've got these references long before Roswell or anything else of stuff that certainly 30 or 40 years later would have been called some sort of UFO encounter. But no one's using that terminology. So it's a long story, but to keep it short, what Leon Bone, the Bureau of Investigation investigator, does is that he eventually sort of finds that these guys, that Van Valkenburg has a group of a dozen or so men. I should also mention that they're all sort of on the fringes of the Mormon church. That is, they claim to be Mormons, but I'm not sure their behavior necessarily fits with it. And Van Valkenburg at one point also claims to be an ex-Mormon, an ex-member of something he calls the Mormon Secret Service. Who knew?
Danites.
Yeah, he's in connection with. So he's dealing with federal agents. He's dealing with what he claims are high people within the LDS Church. And at the same time, where are they getting all of this stuff? Well, they go, well, where do we get all this stuff? There's this kind of magical being. There's this super being that we call the adept, or the old man. And he lives in this large craft, which always sort of, is up like 30,000 feet, and which we fly up to visit. And again, what Van Valkenburg is describing is a spacecraft in synchronous orbit. Okay,
Right.
Nobody talked about things orbiting the Earth, but this is this is what he's doing.
You mean similar to the Ouroboros? Okay, keep going.
And again, where is this guy that has no real technical background sort of coming up with these ideas?
Mhm.
So, and by the way, I'm not in doing this insisting that everything that Van Valkenburg was saying was true. In fact, it almost certainly wasn't in some way. But if you're going to make it up, where did he get the ideas to make it up? So they have this whole sort of secret society that you have to be initiated into, and the adept has to approve you. And the Fed, Leon Bone, the sort of Mulder of his day, joins this and gets initiated so he can try to figure out what's going on. Now the problem comes in that this is the period of World War I, and the US by this time has entered the war. And so there are other feds in Salt Lake City and in Los Angeles who look at this and go, nah, now these guys are all some sort of German agents. This is all some sort of insidious, plot by the Hun. And you've got other people going, yes, they're going to burn Utah. This is the whole idea. They're going to set the whole state on fire. So immediately Bone finds himself in a conflict. He's trying to gain the confidence of this cult to figure out what they're up to, while he has other officials who want to arrest them and put them on trial for something, being spies. And eventually that's what happened. His investigation is short-circuited. There's a fellow by the name of Robert Whitson who comes in from LA, has Van Valkenburg and his buddies arrested, and they are, the question is, what are we going to prosecute them for? Because we can't really, figure out what it is. And they try all kinds of things. They found out that Van Valkenburg was having an affair with a married woman, so they tried prosecuting him on morals charges. And when that doesn't work, they eventually just try to demonstrate that he's an obvious liar. So one of the things they do is they place him and all these other guys under surveillance. I mean, they're watching them 24 hours a day. And so the idea is that if these guys are going to go out somewhere and get in their little spaceships and start flying around, then we'll be able to catch them. Well, they never do. They never see them leave the house. Nevertheless, at his trial, they actually are put on trial. Van Valkenburg and others go, oh, well, we did go. We were flying these because the lights, and this I should note is notice one of the interesting parts. People really are seeing lights in the sky. I mean, there's something weird going on, and that question is never answered in terms of what those are. So while Van Valkenburg and the rest of his cult are being watched 24 hours a day, these lights in the sky continue to appear. So that of course leads the other investigators to figure that this must be an even bigger German plot than we thought, and these guys are covering something up. And they go, no, it was us. We were actually out doing this. They'll go, well, no, you can't, because we were watching you the whole time. There were eyes on you constantly, and you never left your house. And Van Valkenburg will just give these explanations that, well, I can't really explain it, except we did leave our house.
Right.
So maybe you saw us in our house, but I don't know. So now you get into weird things.
Wow.
About location. So they in a court of law where they're on trial, they continue to insist upon the validity of things that all evidence argues could not possibly be the case. So what eventually happens? Well, Whitson and the others figure out we don't really have anything to prosecute these guys on. So instead, we'll get him declared insane.
Of course.
So they bring in some shrinks from the State Mental Hospital in Provo, and they examine them, and their determination is that, well, in almost all respects, these men seem to be perfectly normal, except about this whole airship thing, in which obviously they're crazy. So what they're suffering from is selective insanity.
Oh,
That's an interesting term. So they're not
That's very
totally.
fun. I'm a mental health nurse. I've never heard of Selective.
Maybe it's just in this. So the thing is, otherwise they seem to be perfectly sane, but obviously they're crazy about this. So we're going to judge them insane enough that we'll send them to the mental hospital. So that's what happens. They get sent and they're there for about a month, and then they're released. And then no one ever talks about this again. Van
Because they
Valken,
didn't want to go back to the
they didn't
mental
want to.
hospital.
I think that was the deal that must have been cut. Was that you shut up about this, and we'll let you out of the loony bin. Otherwise, you'll stay. So as long as you continue to claim that these things are true, you won't get out. So some sort
I
of
mean,
deal was made. They
I
all go
think the
on to
same
have
deal. It's not a pleasant place. Yeah.
sort of normal lives. Nothing really changes. Leon Bone, who's always very frustrated that he was never, his argument was that if you just let me do my thing of infiltrating this group, maybe I could have figured out what was going on. And so he remains quite frustrated about that. But so it's just one of those things that just kind of fell into my lap. It's got,
Wow.
it's kind of this thing that seems to be out of time. And here's the thing that, having just, if you just listen to the my short rendition of it, the thing you find is that there's no definite conclusion to any of it. And there's not.
Right.
You never know what part of the story was true, what part of it was false, whether Van Valkenburg and the others really are making this up or whether they were selectively crazy. And then you've got the fact that even after they go off to Provo, there's still people seeing lights in the sky spinning around.
Oh
No
my
one
gosh.
ever answers that. So on one level, that's often what I tend to encounter in my research, is that I find things that defy any kind of easy explanation. And, for a lot of your listeners, and even for me, that's very frustrating because we like to have answers to things. But the reality is that very often you don't. You're never entirely certain. Something happened, but exactly what it is, well, you can't figure out. And
No.
that to me is what really makes it interesting.
A true conspiracy theory because we cannot have a definitive answer. But nonetheless, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was made, and this is a very similar story with the lights in the sky and talking to certain people. Like, somebody heard this story and ran with it. That's my guess. But then you go into AWAS, and I'm saying, this sounds like Crowley. This sounds like the same kind of thing that happened to him in Egypt. And so a lot of people skip over AWAS and go straight to Lamb. You very seldom hear about AWAS with the general public. They go straight to Lamb. I'm not sure why, but that's what I've noticed with my studies anyway.
Well, there's the picture of Lamb, which
Yeah.
people will argue is, looks like the archetypal
Gray.
gray alien with a big head. I have to here. I might actually destroy something here. I don't know. We'll see. There was an artist friend of mine who was, talking about the picture of Lamb, and who said that, well, that's not a big head. All that is it's perspective. It's just this figure is just bending over, looking at you.
Yes.
You have
Like
to
a
try to
fisheye view.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's kind of bending forward, and once I look at it that way, that's all I can see now. So
I am very of the thoughts that these things, when people channel, are more like John Dee and they're fallen angels, and they can appear however they want. So why would they choose something terrifying? I think it would be more normal, like you. I don't think. Yeah.
the argument be they yes, that they can appear in whatever form they wish.
Mm-hmm.
And if they appear terrifying, that's because their whole goal is to scare you. Depends on
Mm-hmm.
what kind of response they want to evoke from people.
For sure.
And that's the usual thing that you tend to find, is that any sort of encounter with let's just say entities. Okay, that
Right.
there's some sort of intelligent being that isn't human, doesn't seem to have any kind of definite physical form, but which is capable of thinking and plotting and scheming and communicating. And they like to mess with us.
Yeah,
That's that's
definitely.
that's that's as much as I could boil it down
If
to.
if anyone has any qualms about the messing with part, here's a fun fact. Edward Kelly, go get married. Edward Kelly, why are you married? It's like, okay, what do I do?
Well,
Yeah.
it's the thing with with Kelly and Dee, so Kelly's the channeler, and he goes, "Oh, you know what the angels told me? We should switch wives."
Yes. And then have a baby and you get to
Yeah,
raise
and,
it.
and, and it turns out that Dee's wife was not down with that at all. She didn't
No.
like Kelly. Okay, so
Mm-mm.
now her husband comes to her and he goes, "Well, you have to sleep with Kelly." She goes, "Ah, I hate that guy." No, no, no. The angel said that you have to do this, or we won't get any
Mhm.
more messages. And yeah, not only does she forced to essentially by her husband to have sex with a man she doesn't like, but then also gets pregnant by him.
Oh, what a nightmare.
So
Can you even imagine? Poor lady.
uh, So, here again is the basic question, and we have to confront this question. So, did the angels really tell that to Kelly, or did he just make it up so he could sleep with Dee's wife?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a curious thing when we get into the channeled religions because there's always a price to pay. When you think of Muhammad, it was, he would go into these dark spells and then he would come out with messages and the scribes, well, later scribes because they were non-written people at that time, but right, he would tell the message, but what happened with him? Not only polygamy, but pedophilia. Then what happened with Joseph? Same story, but not only with polygamy, but actually everybody just goes into polygamy, but it was also polyamory because he was sleeping with married women. And then we get into Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard in the desert. We don't even want to talk about what they were doing sexually because it will be graphic and we will get in trouble. If you want to go search that out, check it out, people. The desert has many secrets that it needs to hold. They channel, write a book, but always the sexual price to be paid, right? And even down to Nexium, like you get to these weird offshoots, it's always about sex, money, and power, right?
Well, when these entities or whatever they are, if first of all, you have to accept their existence. And
Yes.
I'm a tough sell, but let's put it this way: since people have been talking about these things everywhere, okay,
Yes.
this seems to be a commonplace human experience in one form or another. So something's going on. Okay.
Yes.
Something's good. Don't know what it is exactly, but there's something going on. And whenever these things show up, my suggestion would be stay away from them. Because
Yeah.
if you look carefully, you'll find that for the human, usually doesn't work out too well.
It's up to
Okay.
no good. Yeah. They are
Usually the
not kind.
human usually ends up dead. And I might argue,
Yes.
let's consider the case of, well, Joseph Smith. What happened to him? Okay.
Oh,
Here's
yeah.
another one. Joan of Arc, French
Yes.
peasant girl. And she starts seeing visions of what saints. And next to a fairy tree, by the way, where people had been
Mm.
doing all kinds of things for centuries prior to that. And what will happen? The Fatima revelations, 1917, again in Portugal, some children are out, saints, and then the Virgin Mary appears to them. And by the way, two of those kids very quickly end up dead.
Mm.
That's part of and they'll always show up and they go, look, you've been chosen. You little human have been chosen to be told
Yes.
some really cool stuff. And
And it always leads to magic. It's so fascinating to me because Joseph Smith, who indoctrinated the magical underwear, did not have them on when he died, but he did have on a Jupiter talisman. People don't look into the occult beginnings of this stuff. And I'm like, well, I mean, charisma it gives him. People said if he went into a room with people that he totally screwed over, he could come out smelling like a rose. And there it is.
There's another term for that: con man.
Yeah.
It is in some ways the kind of art of a con. That's you have to have. I often look at. Here's one of the things I suppose that interests me about something in terms of secret societies or more broad, you could say cults in some way, is that I'm not interested in them because I want to join one. In fact, that whole idea doesn't appeal to me at all because look, I couldn't even tolerate Cub Scouts. Okay. So, and I'm one of those people, I don't like to join things. I know I'll observe what's going on, but I don't want to join it because as soon as you join it, somebody is telling you what to think and what to do. Always. So I like to look at it from the outside. So I'm always kind of fascinated as to what is like, well, why
you mean you're Rick, you're not a man who'll do such things for pretty banners. Does that not sound familiar? So funny.
I'm not saying that I couldn't be convinced. Okay, I'm not going to claim here that I'm not beyond being conned, but I would like to think that it would take a little more effort in some cases.
Pretty ribbons is what he said, I believe.
I lived in my grad school days in Santa Barbara, California. There was a person I knew, not a close friend, but someone I knew who ended up joining one of these a cult. I'll call it that what it was. They would call it a religion, and it was the sort of Fellowship of the Sun or the Sunburst family. It's a typical thing. There's some guy who's the leader of it, and he's channeling information from beyond. And people join it. And one of the things you do is that, of course, you turn over all your earthly possessions to him. Right?
Of course.
And he buys a yacht. Sails around on it. I'm not kidding. It's obvious that the leader of this thing is just using these people's money to live a lavish life. And they're working for nothing on his farm and in his restaurants. They literally just become sort of slaves to this. And so my question to my friend in this case, after going through it, was very simple. What the hell is the matter with you? I mean, really, what are you thinking? I mean, don't you see that you're just being manipulated and that
that's what I asked myself before I got out of Mormonism.
No, they don't get it.
I'm sorry.
You haven't, you just don't understand. It's like, I don't understand completely. You're being conned.
Yes.
Or maybe I don't. Maybe I am missing something there. But that's, it makes it endlessly fascinating, I guess, once again, because you can never quite fathom what's going on in people's heads. So there you go.
That's for sure. You put that so perfectly, because what do you do with that when it's a belief? And I've been on both sides now, and I can say when I was at the top of the top, I was like, oh, look at these Goyim, so silly. They don't know how I know all the things, and you just have this puffed up ego that is like, oh, well, I'm going to heaven. Clearly you don't understand. And then when you get out, you're like, oh my gosh. It's always back to that.
I think maybe, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that in some ways you do get this example of a kind of selective insanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill always had something to say about everything. And supposedly, if my memory is working today, he once said that everybody is a little mad about something.
Mm-hmm.
Which meant that, there's some, you'll get into some level, no matter how level-headed, normal somebody seems, you'll find some topic, something that they just seem to have lost all capacity of reason about, and that they hold this to be absolutely true.
Yes.
And if you look at people, if you look at intense sort of religious devotion, whether you want to call it a cult religion or whatever it is, you find people who in most ways can perfectly, they seem to be perfectly reasonable, functional And yet, on that one level, no. But when it comes down to Bob, I believe everything that he says, and I'm going to
Yes.
give him all my belongings. I'll sacrifice my children to him. It just depends on how far you want to go with this stuff. And they
Yeah.
just they become, from my way of looking at it, they've gone insane over this one
Mhm.
thing. They're no
The
longer,
selective, yeah.
selective insanity, that you're just nuts about that
Once
one.
again.
So maybe it's a thing.
And yeah, I'm starting to wonder because I've been there and done that, and I think, well, I mean, every time we talk about somebody that's super influential, like it ends up leading into these secret societies and or magic or both. And I'm like, why? Like that's so strange to me that and it wasn't without risk to themselves, because if John Dee had gotten caught when King James took over, he would have been killed. And I mean, so go to it. Thanks, Peanut. So I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, this obviously meant a whole lot to him, for him to basically risk everything. I mean, even his
And
wife.
people do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Dee seemed to, he was a believer in this. He'd become selectively insane, or he had
Mm,
become focused on
so
this.
true. So
And well, here's the kind of counter argument to this. And you know, you or I could look at it, or I'll just, I could look at this behavior and I go, you're nuts. Okay, you're no longer
mhm.
behaving rationally. And the counter argument you'll get is that, well, it looks like insanity to you because you're not inside this, but really there's this whole kind of reality that I'm experiencing, which is completely real and logical to me, even though it looks
Mhm.
crazy to you.
Right. Right.
Um,
And
there was,
speaking of looking crazy, right? Like Crowley, almost, I feel like he almost wanted to look crazy, right? Like the stuff he
John,
did, yes, the stuff he did was so over the top that you're like, really? He got kicked out of countries, you guys. Like, this is over the top.
yes. Well,
Yeah.
here's the interesting thing, and I think this is generally overlooked about him. It's one of those things,
Mhm.
again, that just sort of gets glossed over. So one of the things to keep in mind is that Aleister Crowley isn't really Aleister Crowley. His name, and his legal name, his entire life, is Edward Alexander Crowley. So to people in his immediate family, like to his mom, he was Eddie. So
Wow. Can you imagine?
he's named after his father, who died when he was young, and which he had very, he didn't get along with his mother, but he tended to have this kind of idealized image of his father. And also keep in mind that Crowley grows up in what we would now describe as a strict Christian fundamentalist household.
Wasn't
So
his
his
father like a pastor or
Yeah,
something?
he was a lay
Yeah.
preacher. The family made
Okay.
their money in brewing and in real estate, but his father had enough money that he quit and he just went out to preach the gospel. And they're members of a thing called the Plymouth Brotherhood, one of those churches that believes that if you don't believe the way we do, you're going to burn in hell. And we're all part of an elect. Remember, we're the ones that are going to go to heaven. The rest of you are all going to,
Of course.
burn eternally. And so he grows, and that's it's the interesting thing is that the arch occultist, and some people argue incorrectly, the arch Satanist of the 20th century was a person who was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household. So clearly that didn't
So
take.
wild.
And yet, notice that what he does, his father preached the gospel. Well, what does Crowley spend his life doing? Preaching his own gospel. He
Yes.
develops what he thinks is going to be a replacement for Christianity, which he calls the Lema, which all
Mhm.
comes from the Book of the Law, which he channeled through this being Aiwas back in Cairo, the whole sort of backstory to that. But he is his own proselytizer for his own religion. So he is basically following in his fundamentalist Christian father's footsteps in his own strange way.
Right.
But coming back to this whole thing that he's really, so throughout his life, he's two people. There are two identities. There's Edward Alexander Crowley, which all the legal documents refer to. That's the name on the checks. And then there's Aleister Crowley, which is his kind of, I'd actually go so far to say that Aleister Crowley is a persona that he invents. It's a kind of stage name.
Just like a pen name, right? Like for
Pen name.
writers.
It's
Yeah.
a name that he
Yeah.
writes under. It's a name. And Aleister Crowley is the flamboyant, transgressive, wicked occultist.
Mhm.
But all the time, so what you see, what's performing on the stage of life is Aleister Crowley. That's his stage persona. And yet Edward Crowley is always there.
Mhm.
The person who's traveling carrying their passport, it's Edward Crowley. The person who enters the United States in 1914 isn't Aleister Crowley, it's Edward Crowley.
Mm.
So I think in some way that he actually compartmentalizes his life. What happened is that, and is often the case, is that your stage persona overwhelms the real person. Now, you can still see this today if you look at you look at musical artists, or you look at
Oh, yeah.
actors in particular. All right, so
Beyonce,
everybody,
Sasha Fierce. Yeah, they say they channel or whatever, but they all have another person.
they all, they've got a name that the real person is, and then they've got the public persona. And even they would probably say that those are in some ways two different people.
Mhm.
At home I'm Debbie. I'm the same person I always was, but the miraculous Marcy on stage, or whatever you want to
Right.
invent in that case. But that's a phenomenon that you find very often, is that the saying goes is that if you play a role long enough, the role begins to play you.
Mhm.
And
Look at
that
poor Heath Ledger. Look at poor, like, it's just sad, right? Like you can see it. Modern day.
I think it ends up confusing people as to who they actually are, and it means that the whole way in which the world sees you is in a form that really isn't you.
Right.
I mean, that that's not who you are, but everybody else think that's you, and that's how Crowley gets turned into. And I think he liked that reputation to begin with. He gets turned into the wickedest man in the world, you know, because he liked pissing people off. That's part of it.
He
That's
did. He was
part
a
of the
little
whole.
bit well, and he liked to tease people from what I read. He liked to play with people,
Oh,
if not for jest, for other reasons. He liked to scare people too.
and well, it's I was my wife is infuriated, but I was watching this. I was watching a YouTube video. Okay, I watched too many of those, but it was all about this guy, and his whole shtick, his whole thing is that he smokes cigarettes, right? Which is now considered kind of a, but what he was going to do, his whole video was that I'm going to go smoke a cigarette in a handicapped parking space. I'm just going to stand there and smoke a cigarette. So if somebody comes into the handicapped parking space, they can't use it. But that was his whole point. His whole point was that he was just going to deliberately do something that was obnoxious and transgressive just for the sake of doing it that way. So he's not really, it's a kind of joke, but now it becomes this kind of performance. Now, that still doesn't mean that he might not, he could have gotten himself where he could gotten beaten up.
Right.
All right. What he was doing was in many ways going to clearly make people angry, but that's the whole point of this. And in fact, I think you've got a plague of people on TikTok and elsewhere who go around just doing obnoxious things to get a rise out of people, and occasionally they get shot, usually because they've been provoking the situation. But that's partly what it actually fits into, there's an element in Crowley's case of the whole, there's an element within occultism or occult practice, which is about transgression, of deliberately breaking rules as a way of trying to change reality or to try to take control of reality in some way. And Crowley spent much of his life doing that, deliberately breaking rules. Very often, not because he, and the process of transgression can be disgusting and horrifying to the person who's doing it, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to, in some way, it's a psychic process of trying to break out of the usual reality and to find some sort of wider one. And to do that, sometimes you have to do things that just completely terrify and disgust you. But that's part of what.
Well, this is an IQ thing too. I hate to bring that up, but like Albert Einstein got thrown out of school. My dad had a huge IQ. He got thrown out of school a whole bunch. He purposely liked to annoy people in tiny ways. It wasn't some, like, he wasn't hurting anybody. He wasn't but he also was like you. He didn't want to be told what to do by anybody, and he never did. He had to become his own boss, which I tell my daughter frequently because we're going the rounds with that one. But here's the thing. Some people, and it is proven, have more impulse than others. And this is part of it. It's that little, impulse control.
You're talking to somebody who's been accused, and not unjustly, of occasionally having a perverted sense of humor. I like to think of it as having a broad sense of humor.
I'm a registered nurse, and I'm a night nurse, and for 25 years, and I now work at the mental hospital. And I'll tell you what, if you don't develop one, you will be easily offended and constantly irritated. Why not be funny in a broad, and I mean broad for me as well. I appreciate it.
I think in some ways it's a kind of defense mechanism. My wife and other people ask me, well, how can you make fun? How can you laugh at that? How is that sort of funny to you? And I go, well, I have one of two choices. I can either be horrified by it, or I can find it funny. And that it's
you either laugh or cry. There's a reason why there are these statements.
Life can be terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think we often are constantly trying to overlook the fact of what kind of a dangerous world that we live in.
Absolutely.
So,
and some of us just don't fit in boxes. Like, I never have, I never did. Even now, the reason why my podcast is Unfiltered Rise is because I am very unfiltered, and I'm Christian, but I'm not Christian enough for the Christians, and I'm not crazy the other way for the other people. I'm so in the middle that they really don't know what to do with me. Right.
Yeah.
But that's life. You develop your own repertoire, especially if you have trauma. So,
one of the things that I found is that in terms of, I'll admit that I've played what are called practical jokes on people, which aren't
good.
Funny, isn't terribly funny on their end, but which can be hilarious on mine.
Yeah.
So that does involve, and I think there's a certain mild sadism that comes into that you get enjoyment out of provoking anxiety in people. But the thing is what I always tell, well, it's just a joke. Remember, It's just a joke. I'm not really serious about this. But then what you'll find is that your effort to create a convincing joke really creates something that in the mind of the other person is serious. You have unintentionally sort of created, which can have repercussions in that way. And so you have to be careful about it. A broad sense of humor is not always easily translatable to other people. They'll take you seriously.
Nowadays where we have safe spaces in every school, you're absolutely right. Like, we can't be funny like that anymore, because heaven forbid that we offend somebody. Everybody's so
my feeling
easily
about that,
offended. Yeah.
is that just go ahead and offend them. Okay.
Yeah.
When people tell me that, well, you can't say that. Yes, I can. I just did. All right.
Yeah.
So,
What's going to happen to
you
you?
know,
You
and if
know?
you're going to be offended by it, well, but that's the again, there's always a price to be paid for everything. So sometimes the price for getting your jollies by offending someone is that you've just made an enemy. Um, and that an apology won't
Unfortunately.
fix it. But then you have to consider, did I really want to be friends with him anyway? All right.
If somebody's
See,
whole life world is so fragile that you can't even jest, we have a problem, because that to me is a sign of instability in general of who you are. The people that are the silliest or the foulest, like I cuss too much for the common whatever, I'm always in trouble for something because I'll say things off the cuff or whatever, and I don't mean it to be odd or whatever. This is just how I am, and you have to put yourself in a box, and maybe some of us just don't fit in the box, right?
I think that sometimes you have to say things out loud to determine how absurd they actually are.
Right.
It's and I've done that. It's sort of a semi in jest. I've said something, and I realize that in saying it out loud, that's just completely ridiculous.
Right.
Rather than as opposed to just this kind of thought in your head, because that's something else again. So I think you need to do that. I mean, try it out. If you really think
Well,
this
and
is a
then
good idea.
people always say, you just said what everyone was thinking. Like, why are there all these quotes about this stuff and honesty and the people? They say that there's studies, not just me conjecturing. There is studies that people that swear a lot actually are very honest, because they just say whatever's coming to their mind. I'm very much like that, because I like the quote that, if you never lie, you never have to worry about it, right? Like, you don't have to tell another lie and another lie to continue the facade, because why? I don't have time for that. Like, that's just not who I am. And I appreciate people that are the same, because, and I'm not saying everyone has to be the same. I'm just saying, like, why can't we be different? Right? Like,
Well, you're going to be the way that we are, whether whether anybody likes it or
we
not.
try our best.
Just try to fit in. You have to try to fit in. You have to fake it. So,
Yeah.
but that's you just brought up the magic word, I think, and again, a lot of it has to do with the research I do. Crowley, I actually have to say, is probably one of the more honest characters I've ever delved into. Crowley he had his own sort of bizarre sense of humor. He had his particular fixations. He, in a lot of ways, wasn't a particularly nice person. Okay, he's not a guy you would ever want to lend money to because he'd never pay it back. Um, he had his faults in that case, but he was, in some cases, more honest than you would actually give him credit for.
Right.
So, and a case in point has to do with his connections to British intelligence, because that's one of the things that he would mention off and on. Every now and then he would come out with some statement that, well, when it appeared that I was, everybody thinks I was writing German propaganda in the U.S. during World War I, which he was. Okay, that's exactly
Right.
what he was doing. He was writing anti-British propaganda. He was behaving as a traitor during wartime. But he would say, I did that with the knowledge and with the encouragement of people in the British government. I was actually working for Britain while pretending to be a traitor. And nobody
Mhm.
really believed him. But the thing that I found through researching that is that he was telling the truth. He really was.
Yeah.
I,
Well,
you
and
know,
he would disappear a lot. Like, some of the stuff that you bring up, I 100% can see, because he's unaccounted for a lot, man. Like, he's mysteriously disappears often.
in some cases, probably because, well, here's an interesting case in point. when he came to the United States on Halloween 1914, when he essentially left Britain after the war starts and came over to the US, where he'd lived for 5 years, and he'd canoodle with all sorts of German agents, which was part of his job. One of the things that he noted on his immigration form, so when you came in on the passenger manifest, these are the kind of documents to look at. And there's all kinds of little interesting details. And one of the things that you were asked is that, have you been in the US previously? And he has two dates that are written down, 1900 and 1906. So he says that I have been in the US twice before in those years. And yet, in going through any kind of immigration and passenger records, there is absolutely no trace of either Aleister Crowley or, more importantly, of Edward Alexander Crowley having entered the US in either of those years. Now, I know that in 1900, he's in Mexico.
Mhm.
And I know from his memoirs, from his diaries, that when he left Mexico to eventually return to Britain, he mentions the fact that I traveled through the US, but there's no record of it. So one of the
Right.
interesting possibilities there is that when he was in Mexico in 1900, he's using another name. He's calling himself Isidore O'Rourke. Imagine that.
Wow.
Okay. So, but that's the name that he's using in Mexico City. But I can't find any Isidore O'Rourke traveling around. So the possibility exists that he's using another identity, which
Mhm.
we don't know, that he's calling himself by some other name that is unrecognizable. And then he apparently did the same in 1906. And on how many other occasions might he have done that? So, which means that while his stage name is Aleister Crowley and his real name is Edward Alexander Crowley, that he's also using other names and identities,
Mhm.
but it's all the same guy.
Right. Did we freeze?
Oh,
Oh,
right here.
oh, there we go.
We
Okay,
just fell
sorry.
into a silence there.
Ah, I was like, oh no.
No. So that's, again, it's the industry. It is this kind of that the more you know, the more you find out that you don't know. The more questions that tend to come up. And as frustrating and as unfulfilling as that can be, again, I'd emphasize that, at least, from my standpoint, that's really what keeps you going, because there's always
Right.
something new to be discovered. It's not like you can sit down and go, well, that's it. I figured Aleister Crowley out. There's nothing left to know. No,
All
that just
done.
that never happens. Never happens at all. Um,
Right.
I mean, look, I've been married to the same woman for 40 years and I can't figure her out. So why should I figure her out? So,
Well, women are like that.
I don't know.
That's
Men are
why
much
I can't figure out the whole polygamy thing, because I'm like, really? You want more than one? You must have some sort of really horrible plan with that.
That always, I mean, you got to figure that the basic sort of division here. In general human populations, there are more men than women. Okay.
Right.
Generally, males outnumber females. It just seems to be part of the whole, just keep the guys on edge, apparently, because there's more of them than there are of the others. So if you're going to have polygamy as a general thing, who are all the guys that aren't going to have any girls? Because that's what it
Right.
means. Okay. Because you can't divide, you can't just like make more women. Can't go into the kitchen and just
Right.
make them. So if you've got 4 wives, then that means that there are 3 other guys that don't have any, which seems awfully selfish, but also unsustainable.
Yeah. Definitely not the best idea. And that's why they chuck out all the young boys
Yeah.
in these polygamy compounds, because they don't want to compete.
Yeah. It's because the dirty old men want to keep all the young girls for themselves. Okay.
Yes.
That,
Yep.
I think You need no, what else do you need to explain it? Nothing.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. Yeah. No kidding. And I mean, this whole situation with Crowley trying to hide things. I mean, your stance. I mean, you're not a Thelemite. You're not on his side. You're not. I mean, you're just presenting information, right? Like so.
No, I am not now, nor have I ever been a Thelemite or anything else. No, I don't have anything against them. Okay, I know people who are. I know people who belong to the OTO and they do their
Right.
OTO things, and that's okay. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I'm not really sure I can. I don't honestly know whether I would be able to take it seriously. It probably would be
Right.
best not to invite me. Well, it is sort of connected to this. There was I was once invited to. Well, I've attended 2 Wiccan weddings. Okay, so Wicca is the sort of modern, cool kind of witchcraft that supposedly is derived from Crowley, and it's not. Okay, it's just
Right.
sort of made up.
It's more
But
like pagan worship to
it's like
me.
let's throw a bunch of stuff in a blender, and we'll come up with
Yeah.
something that seems like modern witchcraft, which is at the same time old witchcraft, but it's modern. It's whatever you want it to be. One of those weddings was just, it was like a Society for Creative Anachronism meeting. You had guys in kilts and, in some sort of quasi medieval costumes, and, it was make believe. It was just people pretending to be these things.
Right.
The other ones took it much more seriously. And they took it seriously to the point that at the wedding, after the ceremony, they consummated the marriage on the ground in front of the guests, which was not erotic. Okay, it was
Uncomfortable at best.
it was embarrassing. Okay, I mean, it was one of
Yeah.
those things where do I look at this or do I look away? You know, and it was I was just astounded that the guy could get an erection under those circumstances, but
Yeah, and that's a lot of
not
pressure.
easy to do. But I can accept the fact, these people take this serious enough that they're going to do that. They're placing themselves in a kind of vulnerable, embarrassing situation. And it was kind of interesting to observe, but there was nothing there that really wanted to, this wasn't something that I would want to do. It was
Right.
it was behavior that I could kind of look at from a detached anthropological point of view, but that's it. So no, the whole thing is that again, Crowley was a person like all human beings with a great many faults. Maybe he had a few more than some others, but he wasn't, as far as I can see, just looking through, trying to look in a reasonably detached academic way. His reputation for wickedness is greatly exaggerated. And I think it was one of those things that towards the end of his life, he came more and more to kind of regret. But what he discovered is that if you spent a lot of time openly creating that impression among other people and kind of reveling in that impression, that you get a stink on you that doesn't get off easily. That has now become you. Whether you like it or not, that's who you have made yourself, and that's who you're going to be.
Yeah. Do you think he had any real true belief in it all? Do you think he really, like, in your opinion, or do you think this was a grand facade for his, spy career?
That's an interesting. That's kind of the $64,000 question, and it's a combination of. It's again the thing that's common among a lot of the people that I've looked at, and not just Crowley. I said that he was probably one of the more honest. There are other people that I've looked at who are just pathological liars. I mean, you can't believe anything they say, and yet sometimes the thing that's surprising is that when you find out they're not lying.
Mm.
And it's usually this kind of process of where they're using that to cover everything up. Crowley, in certain admissions, when he's basically talking about magic, one of the things he goes is that, and magic, roughly, to give his definition, which I think is the best, is that it's trying to cause change in conformity with will, which is
Right.
mind over matter. It's also the same stuff when people talk today about manifesting things. When people
Mhm.
go, well, you have to manifest. That you're engaging in a magic ritual when you do that, folks, because
Right.
what you're trying to do
Absolutely.
is you're trying to imagine a reality that you're then trying to create. You're trying to create change in conformity with will.
Well, and you're pulling it out of the ether. Of course it's magic. Yeah.
You're trying to compel these things to happen. And I'm not going to argue here whether you can or you can't do that, but you can believe that you can in this case. But what Crowley would say, I think, is more honored, is that yeah, these things work, but I really don't know how.
Mhm.
And I don't know. The thing he said is that don't worry about whether or not this is a manifestation of something outside you or it's a manifestation of something inside you.
Right.
Even those voices you're channeling, is that really an external being or is it just some part of your own psyche that you're communicating?
Mhm.
Because look, the only thing that matters is whether it works. And as
Right.
long as it works, you can sort of imagine it any way that you want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I mean, who know like how would we ever prove or disprove it, right? Like only half of the population has inner monologue, which is bananas to me because I didn't realize that until much later in my life and I thought, "Oh my gosh, are you serious? Like that there is people that in this world that don't have this?" Like and so like you said, is this a louder inner monologue for someone? Is this channeling? Is this who knows? How could
does
we
all of
prove it?
this did all of this power sort of derive from us, or is
Mhm.
it something which comes from the outside? Well, you don't know. Okay, let's put it that way. You can't clearly demonstrate because if you're the only person in the room who's seeing this, okay, if you
Yeah.
see the Virgin Mary in the corner, but no one else does, is it? Here's something you might, from at the standpoint of a psychiatric nurse. There was another fellow I knew who was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Okay, and of course he was given pills to handle that type of thing because he would have hallucinations.
Mhm.
And he would, this will sound familiar. He kept going off his meds because he liked the hallucinations.
Mhm.
Because it was, the meds did all kinds of things. They dulled his senses, that made it difficult to concentrate, and he really liked, he liked being crazy rather than being some sort of drug semblance of. And his whole argument is, he goes, look, this is my reality. Okay? If I'm
Right.
seeing the dragon, I'm actually seeing the dragon. I don't care that you can't see it. That's my reality, and this is the reality that I want to live in.
Mhm.
So I
Well,
don't
it's
want to
far
go.
more interesting.
Yeah, it's far more interesting. So look at the dragons. Okay, look, my reality has dragons and yours don't, and you
I
call
mean,
me
sounds
crazy.
fun.
So, well, until they chase
I'm
you.
teasing. I'm teasing.
Um, but I think he had a kind of point in that way.
Mhm.
And he wasn't as if he was constantly a raving hysteric. It was just that he would, on occasion, see things that other people couldn't see. But and that was something clearly that was a kind of manifestation of his psyche. So Crowley, I don't. My impression generally is that what Crowley was dealing with, he was encountering things that actually happened and that were real, but he never made any pretense of actually being able to explain what they were or how they worked. It's well, here's the interesting difference between, I think Crowley would make, between stage magic and real magic. Magic with a C
Yeah.
and magic with a
Yeah.
CK.
Mhm.
So in stage magic, what you're dealing with is a trick. It's an illusion.
Right.
And it's all accomplished through a lot of practice. But you're making it appear that something is, that you're altering reality and some, you're going to saw a woman in half, whatever it will be. And, the audience watching it knows that that's not really happening. But the whole thing is they can't figure out how you did that. Okay. How
Right.
did you make the elephant disappear? Well, it's a very elaborate trick, which requires a lot of planning and a lot of rehearsal. But once you've got the trick down, it works every time.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the set. Whereas if you're trying to do real magic, you're having to deal often with those kind of strange, non-corporeal beings. You're having to deal with some other kind of intelligence which has to cooperate or not. You know, so if you're
Oftentimes they're
trying,
very not nice to people too.
ornery,
Like, but
okay,
yeah, John D and them said like every time they would come, they had to do certain baths because they didn't like the way they smelled and they made fun of them and they were cruel. And then the pain, like they would get stabbed sometimes, with invisible
yeah,
type swords
I
and
can mess
whatnot.
with you. Yeah, so if
Yeah,
you're going to summon the
torture.
spirit of Bartzabel, you better have your magic circle drawn correctly and be in the right position, or I don't know, they could tear you limb from limb. So that's, you don't have total control in real magic. In fact, a lot of the time, they won't cooperate at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, from the standpoint of the observer, from the standpoint of the audience, let's assume that you're an occultist, you're a magician in this case. Well, do you want to go through that effort all the time? I mean, do you really want to go through the effort and the stress and the uncertainty and the danger of actually summoning a demon? Or do you just want to have a trick that makes it look like you did, which, as far as the yokels looking at you, accomplishes exactly the same thing?
Right.
So you see, someone you from the outside, you're never quite certain whether you're looking at the real thing or whether you're looking at the trick that appears to be the real thing. And that's true for so many things, not just magic.
Oh, yeah. And it doesn't mean he didn't do it before. It just means, like you said, the amount of time, effort, energy, blah, 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 this takes. Like, I don't doubt that possibly he had contact for real. But do I think always? Like, I mean, that's a lot to just perform under, these circumstances all the time. Like you
Well,
said, you want to guarantee.
he was Crowley was never an official member of it, but he had a fairly close relation with a group in England called the Society for Psychical Research.
Mm,
And they investigated psychic phenomena, especially mediums,
mhm.
the people who claim to be, channeling spirits. And there's a whole cottage industry of people who were mediums. And the thing that Crowley knew, as the SPR figured out, is that most mediums are fakes.
Mm.
They employ a number of tricks. And so, usually, if you began to investigate mediumship, you'd find out that in most cases you ran across things that you could explain, and they were usually fairly easily discernible tricks if you knew what to look for. And Crowley, arch occultist, had a very dim view of mediums as a whole. And his dim view was based upon one, that most of them were fakes, and that the ones who weren't fakes were usually in the thrall of some sort of sinister entities.
Mhm.
So they're mostly just faking this stuff, but when they're not faking it, it's even worse because they don't really know what it is they're dealing with.
Right.
It's also the same reason why he cautioned that you should stay away from Ouija boards.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
which as a teenager I had some experience with, and I would tend to agree with that. So
Yes. Yeah. I haven't played with one, but I had a neighbor that did, and I happened to be there, and there was some pretty bad consequences. And the stuff it said was true, and it was weird, but her brother passed away shortly after, and it was just a weird circumstance because it already said something about that. And I remember being very young, like 10, and thinking, yeah, I'm never going to touch that. Like after watching that, it could have been coincidence, but it was weird.
Well, in high school, some friends and I, started using one, and it was fun. For a long time, it was quite fun because we'd ask it all kinds of questions about all kinds of things, and we never took the answers too seriously because,
Mhm.
in some cases they were um, made sense. In other cases, they appeared, but at the same time, the Ouija, we didn't have any better name for it than that. But was perfectly honest about the fact that, sometimes I'll tell you the truth, and sometimes I'll just lie to you. It just all depends. What I feel like, and whether I think you're asking stupid questions. If I think you're asking stupid questions, you're going to get bullshit answers.
Yeah.
But there was one, I could give you the occasion where it all began to kind of change. And so, we're a bunch of teenage boys, we're sitting around, and somehow the subject of teenage girls came up. And there was one girl who was mentioned, and the response was that, oh, she's going to lose her head.
Ooh.
And not long after that, not the next day, but within the next few weeks, she was killed and decapitated in a car wreck.
Yep. Yep. Mine was, she asked if her brother was going to die soon, and he hung himself the next day. He was 10. That's not normal. And he wasn't in the room. He wasn't even in the house when we were messing with it. So that was weird. And 10, that's very young. I think it was an accidental thing on the clothesline, but it still was very strange. And I just remember thinking, nope, never again.
Yeah, that's the whole thing about her losing her. And the thing is that, that was okay. There was something going on there.
Mhm.
And I always thought it was interesting is that it didn't really come out. It didn't say she's going to be killed in a car wreck. It just said she's going to lose her head soon.
That's wild.
And I think that we all realized what was, and I think that was the point when we sort of realized that, this is uncomfortably real on certain occasions. And
Mhm.
maybe we should kind of back off a little bit.
Right,
Which
because you never know who you're gonna get. Yeah.
it was never really fun after that, and in fact, it became increasingly dark. Once our doubts began to occur, or I shouldn't say it that way. Once we actually began to take it more seriously, it became increasingly darker.
Mhm. Yep.
And that's when you begin to get these things that would come on that you couldn't get rid of, and
Mhm.
would always became sort of hostile and threatening, and the rest of it. So yeah, that left me with a very bad taste about them, and I don't even like to be in the same room with one. Let's put it that
Mm-mm.
way. I could, but
Oh,
it
you
would
think
make me.
it's fascinating that they sell this as a children's toy?
Yeah.
Like, that is so strange to me because I've talked to someone named Zachary King, and I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he is an ex-satanic grand wizard, and there is not that many of them. Like, when it's not like priests or whatever in the satanic church, this is a rare calling, okay? And he's out and he became a Catholic, but he spoke to me about a bunch of things. And the thing that led him into this, like the beginning, and it was insidious, is playing Bloody Mary in the mirror. And I'm like, it led, like you said, it didn't leave him alone, but it was giving him things and money and da 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 da. So of course he's gonna, keep it around. It wasn't sinister at that time. And then as time went on, it became more and more demanding of certain things, and it got really dark. But it just makes you wonder how many people, if this is just like you as a kid, me as a kid, him as a kid, how many people are inundated with that? And then you add in trauma and different coping mechanisms, or people that have like no one, and they need that, thing, that connection to something, because maybe they're ignored or whatever the case may be. And then we wonder why they're psychopaths, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
There's a. Have you ever seen a movie called The Witch? Fairly recent. Takes place in
I
like
don't think so.
Massachusetts. It's worth watching. It's not bad.
Okay.
And at the end of it, the witches are actually speaking Enochian. Okay,
Oh,
the angelic language of John Dee.
yes, yes.
So keep in mind, it's a movie. Okay, which that means it's a movie, which means it's the presentation of something that appears to be real but is not,
Mhm.
but which nevertheless, as an observer, we accept as real.
Right.
Even think about
And
spoiling
there's
enough
magic.
movies.
There's magic in that as well.
There is. Every
Oh,
time you
yeah.
go to a movie and you watch something, and at some level, you know that none of this is real.
Hmm.
Okay, these are not the real people. None of these people are not really dying. But you have to be brought into it, and your emotional responses are as if it is real.
Right.
So that little digression aside, the interesting thing in The Witch is that at the end of the film, the female protagonist, a teenage girl named Tamsin, she sort of, lost most of her family at this point, and she's now alone pretty much with this large black goat, Black Phillip, which you've kind of figured out is probably a manifestation of the devil at this point.
Mm.
And she, not knowing what else to do, she's looking at the goat and she's asking, can you understand me? Can speak to it? Because her younger siblings had actually told her that they would talk to the goat. So she's going, can you talk to me? Do you understand what I'm saying? And eventually it's sort of off screen, and the goat says, "What dost thou want?
Mm.
What do you want?" And she thinks about that for a minute, and her response is, "What can you offer?" And the deal is made. And that's often, I think, the kind of very basic approach that you would get. And very often what I think these things, for lack of it, are often trying to figure out, what do you want? And I can see too that you can get it in some form or another. Now, there's always a
Mm.
cost in that. Nothing is free.
No.
Okay. They're not philanthropists. Okay. They're not actually there. I mean, maybe they want to help you in some way, but they could tell you anything.
Mm.
But there will always be a bill that will be presented for whatever gifts are given. There are no gifts. There are things that are loaned and the rest of that. Um,
Yes. Yes.
but we've always known that. That's what the whole story of Faust is about. Okay, there's
Hmm.
nothing, and I'm sure there are Greek and Babylonian versions of the same thing. Those deals have been made ever since we have existed.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And people think this is all just about, we'll take Kobe Bryant, for example. Um, these gifts are just born, right? Just born into these people. They're just more special than everybody, whatever. But look backward, because Kobe Bryant, for example, he paid the ultimate price, but also if you look before he died, he was making a children's book series, and it is something, talking all about how he was talking to something that was basically like a Harry Potter with Kobe Bryant in there, and magic and this and that, and you look at it and you go, really? Like, I mean, the fact that almost all of like big stars have a child that dies, or somebody, very close to them, a mother, a father, some situation. I mean, look through all of them. It is, I mean, if you tallied each person in the real world, and okay, this happens rarely. Some crazy, like, somebody's baby being born really deformed and dying early, like Prince, or another one, and I can't remember which it was. I think it was Ja Rule. His baby got a cord wrapped around her neck on a treadmill from a blind. Like, these things are just really wild. Okay, half the time they are stories that you're like, really? I mean, okay. But sometimes they're boring, like drownings or seizures or whatever. But it's always someone very close to them, mostly children, which is why I conjecture some do not ever have children for that very reason.
Well, that sort of brings you back into the whole concept of sacrifices, that things have to be paid for in some way.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, and I can kind of, it's a very simple question is that, assume that you're, I don't know, a god, a demon, whatever you want to call them. And which would you be more impressed by? The sacrifice of a chicken that somebody just bought at a market an hour ago, okay, which means nothing to them in particular other than the money than they paid for it. Or I don't know, a sheep, a goat, a cow, it's just more expensive. Or
Right.
what would show greater devotion? What would be more meaningful than, what is it? Is it going to be the chicken you bought at the market or firstborn child? Which would you be more impressed by?
Then you get into Rumpelstiltskin, and these are just fairy tales, but actually they're not. They're tales for sure, but yeah.
Well, it's like we were talking earlier about people taking jokes seriously when they weren't, and then there's the opposite of that, is not taking something seriously that you think is a joke,
Right.
imagining that it is where it isn't in some way. So, it's I generally plead agnostic on most of these things, but I say that proceed carefully. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're asked what you want, keep it to yourself. Okay.
Yes.
That's maybe
Yeah.
the better way of doing it in that case.
Yes.
But it's
and
there was a guy that I knew years ago. He was in Bakersfield, California. There you go. Okay, the kind of a creepy place in a lot of, well, I shouldn't say that. People in Bakersfield will take that. Well, it is. It's kind of creepy. But
the place, not the people.
not the people. Not most of them.
Yes.
But he was a defrocked Catholic priest. There's something. He'd been kicked out of the church. It was a celibacy issue, I think, mostly. But he was an interesting guy because while he was kicked out of the church, he nevertheless was still in a way quite loyal to the church in some ways. He was still like this really good Roman Catholic. But he had a very interesting view in this type of thing. And he goes, well, anytime you're dealing with it, he goes, look, and I don't say this from the standpoint of I don't come to this. I don't claim to be a Christian or anything. So but he made an interesting point, which was that he goes, look, very clear. The Bible, everything tells you that who's the Lord of this world? Who is in control of the material world? It's Satan. All right, that's it. It's made abundantly clear. You're told that. And therefore, all power and success in this world is dependent upon the God of this world. The God of the church is the God of the next world. This world is, and therefore everything is determined by that. And all favors and all blessings and all disasters are accountable for that one purpose. So and I remember him saying is that every deal you make in your life in this world is a deal with the devil because he's the only one in control. That's kind of disturbing, but maybe he has a point.
Right. Yeah, I always go back to the story of Job. I mean, we know that God definitely can play a part, but also he allows things. And we know that because if you believe in the Bible, the story of Job is very clear about this. So
the story of Job is I think is probably the most important story there. And I don't think people generally get it. I'm not sure that I get it entirely. But, you were talking about things messing with you. Well, that's what happens to Job. He gets messed with.
Yes.
If you take the story at the basic level,